Let's get some up-to-the-minute political analysis from Lara Spirit, who is the Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times. Welcome to the show, Lara.
Hi, Ed. How are you?
Very well. So we're in the interregnum.
Yeah, we are. It's true.
And we've got 3 weeks to find out, or for Andy Burnham to find out what on earth he's up to. The first big indication will be a speech on Monday.
Yes, that's true. So we've got a speech on Monday on the economy from Andy Burnham. I mean, on devolution and the economy, saying, there will be greater powers to mayors, for example. They'll be looking at business rates, things that we have heard pretty much every firm indication that we could have possibly heard from the Burnham camp so far on this. And I think a sort of wider framing around Westminster not working for normal people is what we can expect. There needing to be a kind of rewiring of the state. And of course, it happens at a very important moment because Burnham is choosing his Chancellor as we speak. They're absolutely firm. The decision on who will be a number 11 next to him has not yet been made, leaving, of course, a number of unanswered questions about his broader economic agenda. So in many ways, what we'll see from Burnham next week in various guises will be an attempt to kind of, I think, reassure us that he himself is obviously a big economic thinker and that, of course, that decision is important. But at the moment, it seems to be taking up, I think, perhaps slightly more energy than some around Burnham would have anticipated.
What, in terms of the new who is new Chancellor?
Yes.
It's kind of created a mini civil war, hasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, not even that mini at this point. I mean, it's like it has...
Full-on scale civil war.
Yes, because obviously people thought that Ed Miliband was the Chancellor, and I think for many people they would say he is still the front-runner, but there are concerns among some senior advisors to Burnham that, Ed Miliband might be a bit of a concerning pick for Andy, particularly because he has certain views on net zero which they think might put Burnham in something of a straitjacket if he needs to be flexible, but also I think there are wider personality questions that some of them have, and that's why there's been lobbying of, for example, Shabana Mahmood, the current Home Secretary, to consider that position. She of course wants to stay as Home Secretary, but this is not a settled decision yet by any means, and the fact that it is not a settled decision I think has left some people uncertain about what this means for the direction of Andy Burnham's economic agenda.
So it's all a sort of a bit of a nightmare because you have this kind of 3 weeks of hiatus. I mean, apart from the speech on Monday, are we expecting anything else coming out next week? And the other thought I had was, Andy Burnham has to handle the optics quite carefully because he doesn't want to appear too kind of arrogant, even though we all know he's going to be Prime Minister. So, I mean, where, for example, would he do his speech? He's got to think about all that, the venue and how he presents himself. People could walk away. I know it sounds slightly superficial, but those images, some people take away, well, he's arrogant and already thinks he's Prime Minister. He's got to think through all of this.
I think you're right. I think there's a balance between showing that this isn't somebody who, as some of the Starmer allies have suggested, is not prepared for power, who's had it handed to him too prematurely, that perhaps they might have wanted to wait until September. I think they obviously want to look like this is a calm, orderly transition in which enough prior thought has been put into these matters that people need not worry. On the other hand, as you say, there is the risk of appearing presumptuous. I think at this point, generally speaking, or at least in Westminster, I don't think people think it's massively presumptuous of Andy Burnham to be making decisions about who might be in his cabinet. It is basically an inevitability at this point that he will be Prime Minister, barring something absolutely mental happening in British politics. So I think it's pretty fair enough, actually, that people are treating this with the kind of understanding that this is somebody who is our next Prime Minister, who needs to make ththese decisions very, very quickly. I mean, needs to staff a whole government very quickly.
When does James Pennell take up his position, the man who's apparently his Chief of Staff?
Yes, so Pennell obviously leaving his former company, Flint Global, with immediate effect last week, just before we saw that story reported in the Times that he'd be taking up that position and will be working on these questions. So that will be very interesting to see what his vision is for number 10, if indeed it becomes clear to us that he has a particular vision. I mean, clearly at this point people want to know exactly what it is that Andy Burnham wants to do with number 10, but Pennell has been a very interesting appointment for some who are trying to read just where Andy Burnham will fall on a kind of, crudely speaking, left or right spectrum of Labour politics, but also on a number of specific issues. Of course, for example, welfare. People are obviously looking back over things that Pennell has said in the past about welfare, there about, obviously wanting a system that is fair, that, makes people want to go to interviews, for example. And I think welfare reform is one of the big totemic questions that Labour will have to grapple with.
The whole thing smacks of it's going to be 3 weeks of hell, because you've just got all these big personalities expecting a job, and you've got this kind of really weird thing where you can't, he should in theory appoint his cabinet tomorrow to end the speculation, but he can't, and people are still in position. So you've been in Poland with Yvette Cooper. What was that like?
I have been in Poland with Yvette Cooper, and I will be publishing an interview with her in tomorrow's Sunday Times. It was very interesting, and it was very interesting to spend time with her because she's been something of an enigmatic figure.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it.
This current question about Labour's leadership. Of course, we know that she told Starmer to go after Andy Burnham won the Makerfield by-election, but we haven't heard much from her by way of overt criticism or explanation about why she felt that was the necessary thing to do, and I get into some of that with her in the interview. It's also very interesting because she met Andy Burnham this week. She met him on Wednesday, I think it was. They had a conversation. I think anybody would look at Yvette Cooper as the Foreign Secretary and think, she probably wants to stay in that role. She would certainly, you'd imagine, want a big role in a future government. And she was very effusive about Andy Burnham in the interview, clearly looking
Yes.
ahead towards
She slagged off Andy Burnham the whole trip.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
She I'm pleased to confirm she didn't, there was none of that. She didn't say a single, I don't think she said anything negative about Andy Burnham. So that to me was a very interesting trip. I mean, we were on the eastern border with Kaliningrad. We were seeing the kind of Eastern Shield, as it's known, that initiative spearheaded by Poland, who of course spend an enormous amount of their budget on defence compared to us. I think something like 4.8% of their GDP. And we had this interview, and I spent these days with her at a time where we're learning about the Defence Investment Plan being published next week, in which, of course, Starmer, we understand, is still not saying a date when the government will reach 3% of GDP. So
but it's another example of this kind of weird interregnum. It's a complete and utter waste of time.
Well, one of the interesting things that I got into with Yvette Cooper was this question of what actually happens to the Defence Investment Plan if it's published next week and Starmer goes. I mean, Andy Burnham clearly wants to have a look at that. Is it going to need to go further? She talks about that, which is very interesting. So I think she's regarded as something of a key figure in this in ways that people haven't fully understood or comprehended. And so it was very interesting to spend that time with her while everything was pretty febrile. I mean, when I was there was that insane story about Shabana Mahmood wanting Mike Tapp, her immigration minister, to be fired. There was also that quote in a Spectator that I talked to her about from a senior Labour source about Andy Burnham being the country's first female prime minister. I think you'll be unsurprised to hear that was not necessarily a sentiment welcomed by Yvette Cooper in our interview. So it was a really, really interesting chance to spend some time with her, and I hope readers.
I think it's really well timed as well, because she is like Labour's almost. Weirdly, she's become Labour's elder statesman, and yet she doesn't have a huge public profile despite having vast experience. She was cabinet minister under Brown and Blair, and so she will be quite influential. So it's going to be really fascinating to read your interview. But let's talk a bit about other political parties, because I was intrigued to see David Bull, who was Reform's chairman, who's somebody I used to go on TV chat shows with. Really? TV's Dr. Bull.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
When?
Well, The Right Stuff. Did you not grow up watching The Right Stuff on Channel 5?
I'm sorry, but that sounds fun.
It was fun. But he suddenly turned from being TV's Dr. Health or whatever to Reform's spokesman on Earth. But it's interesting, it's a bit like a sort of Republican senator criticising Donald Trump. He said that Nigel Farage should take some time out. It seemed to be the first crack in the armour.
Yeah, and I mean, so he, obviously the former chair of the party in post until May, so only recently having departed, said that he was making those comments as a friend and colleague, if I recall correctly, which was interesting, and does come after something of a difficult few weeks for the party, because of course we had the results in Makerfield in that by-election, which of course Reform had been heavily tipped to do well in, and of course I think it's fair to say fought that seat tooth and nail to win it. It was one of their key target seats. They did not win it, and that was, I think, pretty difficult for the party to comprehend. And then we've also had a period of relative quiet from Nigel Farage himself, I think it's fair to say, over recent weeks, which sort of ended with this broadcast round
Bizarre
that he did this week, in which he came under, it's fair to say, quite a bit of pressure over the undisclosed £5 million donation from Christopher Harborne. A question that has kind of dogged him now since it came out in the local elections campaign in May. It played out in the local elections campaign in May, and I think it's now at kind of quite an interesting juncture, obviously, when you have figures like David Bull making these kinds of comments. This is Nigel Farage's party. It's very, when you see these comments, they're interesting because, of course, this is more than any other British political party. It is a party centred around a single individual whom most people regard to be completely omnipotent when it comes to party affairs. And so it's not very often that you get comments like these specifically about the leader themselves. So I don't know what you think, but that was my impression about why it was quite interesting.
I completely agree, and I think there's also an emerging kind of dispute between the Zia Yusuf wing of the party and the Robert Jenrick wing of the party. I think that David Bull making these comments is significant, and I also think, having criticised the kind of interregnum between Starmer and Burnham, the fact is that Labour are taking up all the bandwidth at a point when reform has lost its momentum, and I think that is significant. I don't know whether it will last, obviously, and normal service may be resumed at any point. Talking of which, I was also intrigued by this weird story that Andy Burnham wants to start coalition talks with the Lib Dems.
I think so. Allies of Andy Burnham have suggested that might be a coalition might be something that he would need to prepare for. I think, when you speak to people around Andy Burnham, I think they're more optimistic than that at the moment. I think they're very much in the phase of let's make Andy Burnham as absolutely popular as possible. But this is a Future, the leader of the Labour Party, who in his recent career, particularly in Manchester, has spoken at length about the merits of a so-called progressive alliance between parties, and it was telling, I think, that the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party did absolutely abysmally in Makerfield. I think that demonstrated, and pollsters have said this too, a real anti-reform / ability to vote tactically when you would want to do so. And Burnham's record in Manchester was very much one, and those close to him talk about this, in which he wouldn't directly criticise, for example, the Liberal Democrats regularly. That wasn't the way that he worked. He wanted a more consensual politics.
Yeah,
but
right.
I am old enough to remember when people around Keir Starmer said the same thing to me about him and Ed Vaizey. They'd be like, oh, look, two lawyers.
Never works.
Personally, they actually have quite a lot in common. Maybe they could be friends. And I think pretty telling, especially when you watch the way Ed Vaizey speaks to Keir Starmer in Prime Minister's questions and the way that Keir Starmer responds to say fairly conclusively that I think that so-called progressive alliance didn't work out particularly well.
No, the only one that worked out was the Tory Lib Dem coalition, which delivered one of the most effective and impressive governments we've seen in recent years. Well, Lara Spirit, Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times, thank you so much for coming on, and you can read her interview with Yvette Cooper in tomorrow's Sunday Times, or if you have a digital subscription, you can read it on the Times app, and it'll drop tonight, I suspect. You can read it, you can either decide I'm going to read Lara Spirit's interview with Yvette Cooper or watch the England game, and I know what choice I would make. So it's on thetimes.com tonight, or it's in your paper tomorrow morning.